Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current status of my Sunday sermon. I didn't have a rough draft last week because there was a guest preacher here at Living Stones, and so I didn't write a sermon. And I'm not going to have one next week because I will be on vacation. So this is for the third Sunday in Advent. I've thought for a long time that one of the deep and difficult to see impacts that our present media culture has is that the screens, not just the screens, but the culture around us gives us a deceiving message. And what it says is that normal life should be easy, rewarding, beautiful, and fun. And this constant submersion in screens of beautiful people and newspaper ads and this media immersed world that we live in simply says that, well, what we see, and now it's even worse with Facebook and Instagram, and what we see on these screens, this is how life is supposed to be. And somehow if I had a conversation with Byrne, somehow if your life isn't fun, you're doing it wrong, and you have to go out and do it right. And I think this is frankly deeply impacting marriages and people, and I think in fact it's making a number of people depressed and anxious because they think, well, the rather common levels of the opposite of easy, rewarding, beautiful, and fun somehow means that, again, you're doing something wrong, and it's a very distorted view of the world. Netflix has recently released a movie called A Marriage Story, and it's gotten quite a bit of attention. And the story, I haven't watched it yet. My wife and I are going to watch it actually probably this weekend. But it's a story about a marriage that goes unhappily, like many marriages do, and the couple gets a divorce. And there's a scene here, there's a fight scene between the couples that if you've been married, this might seem eerily familiar, or even maybe you've never been married and this is eerily familiar. One person on Twitter said, is this what everyone is raving about? Because everybody's been raving about this movie. Is this what marriage is like? Because it looks just like a snippet of what my abusive ex would do. And everyone wonders why I don't want to get married. Yeah. And I stumbled across this person on Twitter, and she often speaks the mind of the zeitgeist of many in her situation, in her generation. Another person pointed out a speech given by the divorce lawyer in the movie that basically says, oh, all of us women are victims, and all of you men are the problem. And go into a marriage counselor and sit there with the person and tell the marriage counselor how it's all the other person's fault. You can do that for a very, very long time and get a whole lot of nowhere. Now, in my YouTube life, I've been talking a lot about this meaning crisis. And a couple of months ago, I did a debate conversation with a guy named Vaush, who's an online guy, and he's into gender abolitionism, and marriage and all these things should go. And we talked about this, and one of the things that he said was that we need community, and people should have much more community together, and that would solve a lot of this anxiety and loneliness. And I think he's right about that in fact we do need much more community together. But then I suggested to him that perhaps the reason we have so much community is our affluence, and we in fact choose not to be together. And in fact, Pew Research Center this week did a very interesting survey that showed that in some Asian and African country, the majority of people lived with extended family. And if you look around that map, you'll see very quickly that a lot of this has very much to do with affluence. Look at the US and Canada. We are moving away from each other. And not just in terms of people in a family, but married couples. Dan Savage, who's a popular columnist, I think in Seattle, has a column in a magazine about love and sex, has a YouTube that I stumbled across this week where he basically says monogamy is ridiculous. We're not built for it as human beings, and it's an unachievable goal, which basically means that we should have fairly transactional, temporary relationships with each other. We're with someone else until it doesn't work out, and then we divide if we have enough money to live separately. Now, the church is supposed to make this all better, right? Well, also this week, Rod Dreher, who runs a popular blog, had a very interesting article, which was basically just a letter from a reader who went to a Southern Baptist church and basically said, I have much more community with the people that I work with instead of the people that I go to church with. Isn't the church supposed to be, provide some great community that's supposed to afford meaning and togetherness? And the reality is that no, often we go to church and we just sit next to each other, and that's what we want from the place. And in fact, if you look at some of the comedy sketches by John Crist, two of his more hilarious ones are his Church Hunter, episode 1 and 2. It just shows us as consumers, and we come to church to hear a sermon, and now you might expect me now I'm going to, beat down on all of you in terms of, we need to have better community together, but this stuff is more complex than that, and just having a couple more potlucks or this and that doesn't do it. And so we have small groups and we have Bible studies and we have all of this, but basically we're trying to figure this stuff out, and it's not perfect. Now, we've known this about people for a long time. Jean-Paul Sartre had a very famous play called No Exit, in which basically he had the line, hell is other people, and that play was put on by the BBC, and it's essentially three people are trapped in an art museum, and they discover they can't get out, and they're there with two other people, and hell isn't, whips and chains and fire and all of those. Hell is simply having to deal with other people. C.S. Lewis makes a very interesting and similar observation in his book, The Great Divorce. We are the problem, and what's interesting about C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce is that the gray town, where the book opens up, is very much like what we see in the wealthier, affluent parts of the world, where we move further and further away from each other. And we try and have a technical fix for this, and you will find a lot of psychologists and people wading in and saying, well, here's how you can make marriage work, and Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay, two people who sort of made their name in atheist circles, and how to have impossible conversations. But for most of this is a technical fix. It's not a contextual interaction. If I can talk to people in a different way, and maybe if I can engage in them in a different way, we'll get along better. And there's plenty of goodness that can be found here. But the reality is that all technical fixes are temporary. And time, which in a secular world is your enemy, will run out. And we all know this. Now, the way the Advent season works is that a whole bunch of us use a thing called a lectionary, and the lectionary proposes texts. And so lots of different churches all around the world are using these same texts. And if you look at this week's text, a number of weeks ago we preached about Isaiah 35, and Luke 1:46 to 55 is Mary's song. And so I decided to pick the New Testament text this year and talk about James. And the book of James is, well, Advent is really the intervention of God in the mess that we've made of this world. And there's a first coming and a second coming, a world that has painted itself into a corner, and the promise of rescue from within and without. Because here's the thing, as with C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce, you can take people from this world, put them on a bus, and bring them to the next world, and guess what? Just like people do in marriages all the time, they bring their problems with them, because the problems are not just outside of us, they're inside of us. And those are the more difficult things to address for us. So the real question is, how can people be saved from themselves? Now, the book of James is an interesting book in the New Testament because tradition has it that the book is written by James, the brother of Jesus. He was sometimes called James here's the thing, James the Just or James the Righteous, and he was the head of the Jerusalem church. But a lot of people have had mixed feelings about the book of James, and some people really like it because the book of James is a very energetic book where we are responsible to take matters into our hands and get some things fixed and deal with our sin. So the book has very little tolerance for sin, but the book also has very little tolerance for revolution, taking matters into our own hands in certain ways. And it begins with something that has really annoyed people. Brother and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it pure joy. And you might mean to ask, well, don't you understand the meaning of the word trials? Why would you even say that to someone who is suffering? Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect, so that it may be mature and that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. In other words, you're saying, if I'm suffering, I should endure it. And he says that over and over. And in fact, but he's not easy on anyone. Let the believer who is lowly boast in being raised up, and the rich in being brought low. Because the rich will disappear like the flowers in the field, for the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the field. Its flowers fall, he's quoting the Psalms here, and its beauty perishes. And in the same way with the rich, in the midst of a busy life, they will wither away. And so then we wonder, well, I thought the goal was to get rich so I could have the kind of life I wanted to have, until you begin to realize that a lot of these things that we're suffering are in fact a direct consequence of our affluence in the West. Now in chapter 5, we come to the Advent reading. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and the spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. And right there you see this duality in James that people begin to immediately like, oh good, he's getting hard on us. And there's often it often happens that someone will come to me and say, Pastor, you need to be harder on people. And it's like, okay, shall we start with you? No, I wanted you to be harder on those other people. Well, if you really like the hardness, I can practice that hardness on you, and if in fact I do that, they don't tend to like it very much. And so James seems to do that. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Oh my. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord, because it usually didn't turn out very well for them. As you know, we counted as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. Yeah, Job did plenty of grumbling in the meantime. But the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And this is very much James's posture. And what he is saying here is that we should adopt this posture. And actually what this posture means is we should adopt it with what we get most frustrating about, which is in fact other people, often the people we live with. Now, as that little thing noted that, what do you do when you are out of resources? And so it's no wondering that a lot of the people in Asia and Africa are very poor, and they live together because they can't afford to not live together. And because when you grow old, someone has to take care of you, and they might not have Social Security or Medicaid that will pay your nursing home expense. So you know what? The kids take care of you. And now think that through, because there's both a beautiful side to that and a difficult side to that. Because if your children are loving and generous and caring, and maybe they're that way because you were that way in their youth. Well, maybe that's the kind of treatment you'll get in your old age. But if you didn't spend much time with them, and if you were vindictive and petty, maybe their treatment of you in your old age will be a torture chamber. This stuff is difficult, and it's very real. What do you do when you are out of resources? And that's where James comes in, because the book is about perseverance. Usually the little things we can change in our life, we change. But it's the big things. It's the difficult things. It's the things we can't change. And James says, learn patience in suffering. Patience is the combination of stuck and faith. Patience, in fact, is hard work. It's not passive, it's active. It's disciplined endurance. Patience is how, in fact, trust in God grows. Then in Greek, the word for patience is macrothumeo, which basically means something similar to the Old English long suffering. Patience does not mean you don't suffer. Patience means you endure suffering. And that's exactly what James is offering. And you think, well, how is this helpful at Advent? Because Advent is supposed to be intervention and rescue. And I thought my life was supposed to be beautiful and fun. Isn't that what we're promised? You don't find that in the Bible from what you get in this world. Because if you've only got one life to live, you've got a real problem. Because the time is short. And so if you decide to grab the pleasure, well, that probably means you're going to be by yourself. Because what other people are complicated, and they get in the way of your pleasure. If you're going to eliminate the sources of pain, you're probably going to eliminate the amount of community you have in your life, which all then usually makes you lonely and anxious and miserable. Will you avoid regret? Will you have time? Now, this is where Advent comes in, because the Son of Man comes and is one of us. And in many ways, once he starts opening his mouth in his ministry, it doesn't go well. Again, I've made this point before that people say, well, preachers should be able to make all of this clear and to make our lives beautiful. Well, you can't imagine a better preacher than the Son of God, and most of the people walked away from his sermons frustrated, angry, or confused. I don't think the problem was with Jesus. I think what that illuminates is that the problem is with us. But yet he comes, and he doesn't just shout out messages from the clouds to us. He knows our pain. He knows our temptations, even our cruel, unjust tortures and death. And any reading of the New Testament, of the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, demonstrates that this was something he could have avoided. In fact, that's what his disciples admonished for him, and yet he didn't. But then the Son of Man is raised to life again. Now, again, if you look at this and say, well, I don't believe in the resurrection, well, that's going to impact the choices of your life, because you want to get all that fun and beauty and goodness. You want to get it all in now, don't you? You've got one life to live, and you know what? The clock is ticking, and at some point, you might even lose your hair. The Son of Man will return to complete the story. Well, this slide needs some editing. Now, one of the things that you might have noticed was the end of verse 8. Because the Lord's coming is near. And that opens up a whole big theological conversation that has been raging for the last couple of centuries. And I don't have the time to go into that debate here as to whether or not the New Testament writers imagined that Jesus' coming was near. What we see, in fact, is that it seems that every generation imagines Jesus' coming is near. But actually what this means is also that we see him, and we see him soon. And in that, death is transformed from a deadline for a bucket list we can't achieve to the end of a trial we must endure. And I'd say that we recognize this at many funerals, even now as in our affluent, wealthy society where we have this, we have nursing homes and medical care, where we still realize that when the day comes for many, it's a relief because their struggle is over. And what the Christian faith offers is a rereading of this verse, how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, waiting patiently for the autumn and spring rains. And so James's admonition, be patient, stand firm. Advent is celebration of the coming, first and second. Advent is patient longing for the next. We wait in hope. We wait in peace. It's not ours to repay. Well, there's a lot of typos in this PowerPoint. Where was the one that I missed there? Sorry, this is rough draft, and I do edit. We wait in peace, not ours to repay. We practice joy. We borrow it from the promise. We borrow it from the future. This helps us understand and actually live out what James is saying. We celebrate the foretaste of what is to come.